for connecting to this session, and thanks very much to the organizer and the presenter. It's a session on gender equality and parenting from the baby boom to COVID-19. And we're having 3 presenters. So we're going to start with Petra Moser, then Daniele Pazerman, and finally Matthias Döpke. Presenters, you have between 30 and 35 minutes. So that we'll then have 5 to 10 minutes for Q&As, since there's no discussants. And please, audience, feel free to put in questions in the Q&As and feature in Zoom, and I will read them at the end of the session, and presenters can also put their own questions in the chat if they want. Petra, go ahead.
Thank you very much. This is joint work with Scott Kim, who is a PhD student now at Wharton. And we're looking at women in science. So why we're looking at this, because women continue to be severely underrepresented in science, at least specifically at the higher levels of tenured faculty. And so one potential cause for this are children. Mothers to this day, according to survey data, spend a lot more time on chores and on women. So in the American Time Use Survey 2020 and 2019, for example, mothers spend about 50% more on kids and on chores compared with fathers. And COVID-19 appears to have widened this gender gap. So between February and April 2020, for example, mothers with young children reported that they reduced their work hours 4 to 5 times more than fathers. What we want to look at in this paper is how children affect productivity. Other people have looked at earnings, the effects of children on earnings, but what we want to see, what we want to contribute to this, we want to look at output and productivity. We want to look specifically at the timing of productivity. And then we want to see how, I'll show you that there are differences in the timing of productivity, and that these differences actually have a very large effect on tenure and on participation. We will look at this in the historical context of the US baby boom. Between 1946 and 64, there were, as you see in this picture, lots of kids. And another nice feature of the setting is that at this time, it was clear who was going to take care of the kids. There was the women, so women took care of the children. And people also, this was before the pill, so people had kids very quickly after marriage. And we'll exploit that to use marriage as a proxy for the start date of having children. The data that we're using is ironically comes from the American Men of Science. It was originally collected by James McKean Cattell, who was the first US professor of psychology, and he was the editor of Science for nearly 50 years. He developed this volume for his own research. So he was very, very interested in smart people, and he tried to figure out who are smart people, how they interact with each other. And he also wanted to create I think of this as like something like an interlibrary loan of scientists. So you can figure out who else works on similar topics, and then you can get in touch with them. It's called the American Men of Science. It has Canadians and it has women. So I'll show you a few of them as an example, what's in the data. So let's start with Gertrude Bell Elliot. She is really important even for today. She won a Nobel in Physiology and Medicine in 1988, and she won it for developing a systematic approach to fight viruses. So all of her work builds a foundation for a lot of the stuff that we'll hopefully benefit from soon. Here's Gertrude Elliot. We have her name and her middle name. The middle name is really important for matching these scientists because we want to measure output. So we want to match them really well with patents and publications. The other thing that we'll use is their age. So we know the exact birthplace and birth date for each scientist. And then, let me show you another woman. I'll show you in this example, I'll just show you that we can also We can trace their education very clearly, and we can trace their career progression. So I'll just show you the education. This is Helen Wallace Tull. She's another cancer researcher. She got her undergrad in 1929 at age 17. She married the next year at age 18. She had 3 kids. So you see, we know how many kids they have. Then she got her PhD at age 34, 17 years after her undergrad. And she became an assistant professor at age 41, 7 years after the PhD. And so when people choose to have an assistant professor job or another academic job, we'll put them in a category called academic scientists. And we'll use that when we look at people as people's progression towards tenure. Give you another example. This is Juliana Tesoro. She married in 1943. And here I want to show you that what we're going to do in the rest of this paper, we're going to see what happens to these women's productivity after they have kids. So Tesoro marries in 1943. She's not super productive for the next, 10, 12 years. And then she really takes off. She has a total of 89 patents. One really, really nice thing about this data, I'll show you at the example of Tesoro, is that we know the research topics of each scientist. And this is really important because it allows us to control for variation and output across fields. Say both of my measures are in some way, there might be affected by the fact that in some disciplines, it's harder to publish than in others. And in some topics, it's harder than to publish than in others. So we want to control for that. And we'll do this by using the words in the text, in text analysis, to assign each scientist to a unique field. So what we use here, we use k-means clustering. You can think of it as sort of a multi-dimensional OLS. It's one of the simplest ways of text analysis. So essentially what we do is like we make the words of each scientist that describe their research, that goes into a giant matrix in which each word is a column and the scientist is a row. Then we'll weight the words according to how frequent they are. Say, for example, we want to put a lot of emphasis on a word like germicide and less emphasis on something like research or series, because that's a frequent word. And then we place centroids into that matrix, and we move the centroids around, or the algorithm moves centroids around up to the point where the distance between the centroids and the scientist is minimized. So by that process, every scientist is assigned to one unique field. And that then tells us who else is working in that field. Why are we doing this? Well, let me just show you one example. So we could just use the disciplines. So when I started this project, it's like, yeah, let's just use the disciplines. For example, Cesar Fragola is an engineer, and Elder the Turk works in physics. But when you look at the words that describe their research, so it's like aircraft instrumentation for Fragola, and then design and development of aircraft instruments, it becomes pretty clear that they both work on aircraft. The classification by discipline would have missed their overlap, but because of the k-means, we can assign them to the same field. So now let me show you how you match people with patents and with publications. So the first thing we do, and Alessandra and I have done this in some previous work. So we'll build on that. So the first thing we do, we just have a simple, like a very naive matching process between the scientist and the patent. But then what we'll do a little bit better. We can do a little bit better here because we know how old each scientist is. And so we're going to use the age of the scientist to filter out false positives and to improve the quality of our matching. Let me just show you with a few pictures what that means. So this is the age profile of productivity. Now, before, if you're in your 40s and you're depressed over this, remember this is like, people now are actually productive longer out. Oh, it has changed over time. So, but this is sort of this is the typical age profile. Today, it's like shifted out by like 2 or 3 years. But when you see, so we get a really nice distribution when we match on the middle name. But if we don't match on the middle name, we get a lot of false positives. Basically, we don't get as nice a distribution. This becomes very apparent when we separate our data in STEM, which is the physical sciences, and the biological sciences and the social sciences. Lots of innovations in the biological science and the social sciences are actually not patentable. So if I match people at random based on their names, I would expect to see bad matches, and we actually see bad matches. So when we look at patents, we'll focus on the physical sciences with the STEM, and we'll run it on the full data set as a robustness check. And then the other thing I want to point out is that if your name is John Smith, I cannot do anything to match you with your patent. Like anybody who has a super frequent name, so anything basically in the top quintile of the frequency distribution, it's just not going to be a good match. So we'll improve this. So what we do basically, if you start with just the naive matching, the error rate is 83%. So it's 83% false positives. By doing these adjustments, by matching on the middle names, matching on the field, and including frequent names, we can get that error rate down to less than 5%. So we have here, I think, pretty good quality data, which I think we'll need because we want to look at the productivity of these people. The next thing we do is we match the scientists with their publications because I want to look at tenure. And so that's why very few people get tenure because they have a patent, they need publications. We get that from Microsoft, a Microsoft Academic Graph. And so what we get here, we're going back to Gertrude Elliot. So she has 105 publications, 75 journal publications, and we'll get the year for each of those. So we get for the publications data, we get about 754,000 journal publications by 36,000 scientists. And then this is kind of a fun fact, is that the guy with the largest number of publications in this paper on the baby boom is the inventor of the birth control pill. So, and then we use citations. So we use citations to control for differences in the quality of publications. So now let me show you some summary statistics first on productivity differences across demographic groups. So I just show you the raw data. So this is just the data, nothing done to it. And so what this shows is that this is, again, the age profile for fathers. This is their productivity for fathers. And this is the productivity for mothers. So mothers have a very distinct productivity profile. They get more productive in their late 30s and early 40s, when everybody else is starting to become less productive already. Mothers actually are also more productive in their late 30s and early 40s relative to other women. So this is not just a woman effect. This is actually seems to be specific to mothers. And then interestingly, when you compare men and women who are scientists without children, their age profile actually looks very similar to each other. So now let me just put that in some regressions. And the reason why we're putting it into the regression is we want to control for variation across cohorts. Say if you were born in an area in a year where you may have benefited from investment because of World War II, your productivity might look very different from somebody else. So we take care of that. And we put in the field fixed effects, and we compare the productivity of a person to themselves at age 20. And we do that so that we can say if women are less likely to publish or to patent because they're discriminated against, we want to take that out here. And so what we can see, this is the age profile again of men. And this is the age profile of women. And here again, in these regressions, what you see is that women, mothers, have when you look at their age profile, have this increase in productivity in their late 30s and early 40s. We can also look at this, we can compare these differences across demographic groups, which is what a lot of this literature has done. So let me just show you those results quickly. So what we do as well is we're going to compare differences in inventive output across demographic group. So what I showed you before was within demographic group. Now I'll show you the same across demographic groups. And then again, we'll have the birth year fixed effects and we have the field fixed effects in these regressions. And what this shows you is that women actually patent less. They patent about 67% less compared with men. Mothers patent 77% less compared with fathers. But interestingly, mothers also patent more than other women. So, and we'll come back to this, but this is very likely to be due to selection. Because to survive in science as a mother, you may have to be super productive. And then these results are, again, very robust. So in the first specification, we control for age. In other specification, we can control, in the first specification, we control for the cohort. We can control for age. It's robust. We can include people up to age 80. So in most of the regressions, we cut it off at 65 as the typical age of retirement. And then we can also look at differences in other disciplines. So we can include the biological and social sciences. And what we see is that in other differences, the gender effect is smaller. So when you look across all differences, women patent 52% less compared with 67% less in STEM. But the estimates, again, for parenting is nearly identical. But again, let me say that we want to be a little bit careful for the patent data here because our patent data is super noisy for the biological and social sciences. I'll show you one interesting little result here is that for women, it's the first child that seems to carry the largest productivity penalty. The second and third doesn't really matter. Whereas for men, actually, this is just a correlation, but men with more kids, the more kids you have, the more productive you are. So now let's actually look whether we can get something that's close to a causal effect of children on productivity. So we'll estimate an event study where we estimate the impact of the first child. And so as a proxy for having the first child, we'll use the marriage, because this again is the baby boom and people used to have kids pretty much after they got married. So our goal is here to understand the impact on children on scientific output. It could be that people who have kids just have a preference for leisure and they might just be lazy. But whatever this preference is going to affect my output in a relatively smooth way. So I'm always a slacker and then I choose to have a kid, but that's not going to cause like a discrete change in my productivity. Whereas the marriage and the kids, that's a very discrete change. And the other benefit of this is that the event study approach here allows us to trace out the long run trajectory of productivity after marriage. So essentially, we have a very long time series of data. Lots of papers stop this after 5 or 10 years. We can look for a much longer period in time. So again, what we do is we're comparing women to themselves, and we're comparing them now in the last year before they get married. And we'll put again in the age fixed effects and the field fixed effects. And so these are now separate coefficients estimated for each demographic group. So each line here is a different demographic group. So there's really no surprise for the fathers, but I want to point your attention to the mothers. So mothers actually, what we see here, which I think is very striking, is that mothers become more productive 15 years after marriage. So they have relative to men, their productivity is low in the first 10, 15 years, but after 15 years, mothers become more productive, whereas everybody else declines at that time. So I think if you just remember one graph of this paper, this is the one I want you to remember. So why 15 years? Sometimes people ask us. Now, to me, this is pretty obvious because I have like kids who are like in their teens now. So I feel they're much less work. And I think that's I think generally seems to be generally true as well. So kids just tend to use less of your time when they're older. These are data from the Bureau of Labor Statistics. So now let's actually look at what these patterns in the timing of productivity, what that does to tenure and participation in science. And so obviously, when I'm looking at tenure, somebody mentioned to me, it's not patent or perish, it's publish or perish. So we use the publication data. And we'll run the exact same analysis that we did before, but we just now use a different measure of productivity. So instead of patents, we use publications. And then we'll have those same regressions. So we want to again look at productivity across the life cycle. And we'll have birth year fixed effects, and we'll have field fixed effects, and we'll look at everybody relative to themselves at age 20. And so this is what you see is like for publications, mothers and other women are actually much more similar than for patents in their life cycle pattern of productivity. So you see less of this flattening, but you see more of more like a hill. But I think what's really interesting here is that even though we're using a different measure, but you see still that mothers become less productive relative to themselves. They're after age 27, which is the median age of marriage for a scientist in our sample. And then they recover, and in their late 30s and early 40s, they catch up. So completely different measure, but we actually see that same pattern here. And this is across all fields because we can actually, for publications, we have good data across all fields, not just STEM. So then I'm just going to now show you the regressions. Again, remember the pattern that I showed you over time was the scientists compared to themselves. Now we're going to we'll make comparisons across demographic groups. So again, we have birth year fixed effects and field fixed effects. And I'll show you basically had very, very similar results to patents. Women publish 75% less compared with men. Mothers publish 85% less compared with fathers. The biggest difference is that mothers publish roughly the same as other women. And I'll say a little bit more about that later. Then also actually overall, we can look at this. All of this is robust to controlling for citations. So one interesting thing here, so the results are very, very similar. I have different measures, the results are very similar. But the interesting thing is that mothers in STEM publish roughly the same as other women, but they patent slightly more than other women. That could be because patents are more likely in industries and publications are more likely to be in academia, and there's selection. Mothers may be less able to accommodate laboratory work once they have a kid. And so maybe that's why they're less productive. And then that's why selection is super strong in patenting. It could also be that it's a productivity effect. So motherhood actually may reduce the publishing productivity of mothers in academia more than in science if mothers are less likely to get tenure. And we'll examine both of these channels. I just want to show you, before we go to that, I want to show you that, again, the gender differences in other fields are smaller than in STEM. So where these differences are really bad is STEM. Okay, now let's look at tenure. So what do kids do to your probability of getting tenure? It's not good. So basically mothers who are academic scientists they have 27% of them get tenure. So that's conditional on getting an academic job. So if those mothers who are lucky enough to get an academic job, 27% of them get tenure. That is 19% less compared with the 46% of women without kids, and 21% less than 48% of fathers. So what we see here is that the difference in the tenure rate is really basic. It's almost non-existent for mothers, for women without kids and men without kids. What is really the difference is just all driven by having a kid. So it's only mothers who have lower tenure rates. I can show you this in a different way too, because we can actually look at how long does it take you to get tenure. And so what we see here is that mothers actually are doing just as well, roughly, or not as much worse compared with other demographic groups for the first 5 years. But after 5 years, mothers fall behind and they never catch up. So the probability that a mother gets tenure separates from these other ones after 5 years, after getting your first assistant professor job.
Petra, you're at the 25-minute mark.
Yeah, thank you. So now we're going to show you some event study estimates for tenure after marriage. So essentially, we're going to apply the exact same approach that we had before, and our outcome variable is now tenure, whether you get tenure after marriage or not. So this is the probability of having a tenure job. So let's look at the men first. For men, actually, marriage seems to be great, fantastic, right? The longer you get married, the more likely you are to have tenure and have a tenure job. For other married women, it's not so great, but for mothers, it's really bad. So basically, for a mother, every year after her marriage, her probability of tenure declines. So these are the mothers here. So now let's look at publications. So we know how much they published before and after tenure. So I just want to show you some of this data. So first, I'm going to separate the scientists into mothers who do not get tenure. And so what you see is these are all the people who don't get tenure. And when you look at the women who don't get tenure, they actually, again, they have this productivity pattern. They still keep being very productive, and they actually are productive. The mothers are productive into their late 50s. Mothers who actually do get tenure, their productivity just keeps going. And they have, again, they have sort of very high productivity after age 40. So now let's actually look at differential changes in productivity relative to the year of tenure. This is not a causal effect. I'm just going to kind of tell you what happens to productivity of different demographic groups before and after tenure. And so again, what you see for the men is kind of what we expect, is productivity increases up to the year of tenure and then it flattens. For mothers, the productivity goes up significantly after getting tenure. And so this, I think, if you think about this for a moment, if productivity, if we avoid tenure based on our prediction about future productivity, what that graph tells me is that we're doing a really bad job at estimating the future productivity of mothers. So now let's look a little bit at selection. Don't have that much time, but let me just show you some of the data. So in the paper, we look at selection on many different dimensions, getting into a PhD, becoming an assistant professor. I'll show you a few here. So the first one, I think we're looking at historical context here. And so one way in which this was different, maybe not as much different as we would like to be, is that it actually was harder for a woman to get into a PhD program and succeed in that program. So this is the example of Joan Stites, who was told by a professor at Harvard in the 1960s, like, look, why would I take you on as an advisee? You're just going to get married and have kids anyway. So what good would a PhD have done? The other thing is that actually many programs did not actually even admit women into the PhD program. So it was a lot harder for women to get a PhD. And also the other thing is you may actually, labor theory would predict that if I have, if I'm a woman, I have a lower expectation of being in the labor market for a long time. So therefore it's not worth for me to invest in a PhD. But among American scientists, more women are more likely to have a PhD. So despite these forces that I just described, women were more likely to have a PhD. So, and that could just be, I think very likely, is that they had to kind of be better. They had to be more qualified to get the same jobs. They were just as fast to get from their undergrad to the PhD. So it's not a speed issue. But again, mothers were less likely to become assistant professors. 36% of mothers became assistant professors compared with 45% of fathers and compared with 45% of women without kids. So again, here, even in selection into an academic, into a tenure track job, it's the mothers who fall behind. And so they also take longer to get those jobs. So even if they do get it eventually, it takes them a lot longer to get there. So women internalize that. And so the way women have internalized this, that they just did not get married. So in our data, what we see is that female scientists were less than half as likely to marry over time. And there's some kind of, if you want to call it, improvement over time, like, or it's not a value judgment, but like basically more women get married over time. Then the other thing that's really interesting is mothers also, women chose to marry a lot later compared with men. So this, for both men and women who are scientists, the median age of marriage was 27 years, whereas in the population, men were a lot older than women when they married. Women, I think the big difference though is that women very rarely had kids. 20% of female scientists had children compared with 74% of men. Remember I told you before that like the biggest impact seems to be from the first kid? That's also plays out here, is that once they had a kid, women had almost as many kids as men. So it was basically, yeah, then they were like, okay, might as well have another one. Just really quickly, this cannot be explained by selection into fields. So women do not select into fields that are less patent intensive. There are also no real differences across mothers and fathers. One thing that people have argued about American science, about STEM, is that there are so few women because of preferences. And so this is a very good book on American physics. Daniel Kevles says, like, look, women just aspire to have these more womanly professions. They do home economics, nutrition, and nursing. They don't do physics. So we can actually look at this in our data, and I'll tell you it's complete rubbish. So conditional on entering science, women are actually more likely to be in physics. And they're also more likely to be in mathematical analysis and other fields that sort of are supposed to be harder and more mathematical. But women are less likely to survive in science. So to look at this, we match our scientists with directories of universities. So I'm just going to show you the one here for Columbia University. And what we see is that women were half as likely, female faculty were half as likely to survive in science and to make it into our data set compared with men. So now let me just end by showing you some aggregate effects on participation. So one thing I think that's really nice about the data that I haven't really showed you a whole lot about is that we have the career histories of all of these scientists. So we can actually tell when they entered American science. And so what we do here, and this is what actually got me to write this paper, is that when we just did sort of a check of the data to see whether everything looks kind of okay, what you realize is that they're missing women. So up here, this is truncation. So these people may just be too young to make it into the American Men of Science. But we are missing these cohorts here. While the men are continuing to increase, there is a missing mass of women here. And so these are, and interestingly, these are all women that would have been of childbearing age in 1945 at the beginning of the baby boom. Let me just show you this in one other graph. So this is the date and the year in which they entered American science. This is the run-up of entry into science caused by World War II. And then you see there's this big drop after the baby boom, and that drop is driven almost entirely by women who were of childbearing age at the beginning of the baby boom. So I think I'll end here, and I'll just leave you with the conclusion slide. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Petra. And we have 3 questions from the audience. So I'm gonna, without further ado, jump into those. So the first one is from an anonymous attendee asking, at what age do they become mothers? Is there boost in productivity because the kids are in elementary school or 18 and out of the house? You want to hear them all and then, or you want to go one by one?
Okay, just, so we can only, we know exactly when they got married. We only know when their kids actually were born for a subset of the ones that we can manually match to the US Census. And so that shows us that they have kids right after they get married. But so I think actually the kids have to be older. So this is, I'm just sort of, this based on the pattern that we see, the increase in productivity shows up when the youngest kid would roughly be 12 years old. So it's not elementary school, it's more like middle school.
Great. The next question is by Peng Peng Xiao. Do you see many women postponing marriage and childbirth, especially if they're talented, productive? For women who had kids late, did their productivity peak earlier?
So for the pattern data, we haven't looked, we don't see that there so okay, let me just say, mothers are more likely to have patterns before they marry. And that again might just be selection. So I think the reason why we observe our mothers to be more productive up to age 27 is because if they are not super productive, they have to drop out.
Thanks. Another question by Vita Fajczuk, I hope I'm pronouncing it okay, I think she's saying fantastic study, which I think reflects everyone's sentiment. It looks like you did a monumental job with data. I might have missed this among so many interesting results you presented, so apologies if you already answered this. I wonder if you control for teaching research load, for example, research universities versus liberal arts.
No, we haven't looked at that. So I think what you're saying is that it may not just be the kids, it may also be the teaching load. And that might be a factor that makes it harder. Say if you have your kids and then maybe you get a job because you have kids at a university where you need to do more teaching. That might be part of the effect.
One question, and then I think we need to wrap up, but I think also our presenters have questions. So, but do you feel these results extrapolate to more recent years?
So I hope things have gotten better, right? So this is the baby boom. So we thinking about, we started with the baby boom because there are lots of women who have kids, and then also because I kind of know precisely who does the work. So, but when I looked at the recent data, it doesn't seem like things have changed that much, right? So women, so women don't do all the work anymore, but according to the data, they seem to be doing 50% more. So I think now it's probably a little better. So it's not as extreme as it was back then, but probably, I mean, it still seems women do more. I think as long as women do disproportionately more, we will see these effects.
Thanks. And Daniela, do you want to ask your question and then move on to your presentation?
I think I'll pass and I'll ask Petra separately later.
We'll see if there's more time at the end, maybe also.
Thank you.
Thanks so much, Petra. And yeah, our next presenter is Daniele Passero.
Okay, so thank you very much for having me and for including me in this session. The paper I'm presenting is on female labor force participation and intergenerational mobility. This is joint work with Jürgen Modalsli and Claudio Olivetti and Laura Salisbury. And in contrast to Petra's excellent work, which was really a lot of work, this is very much work in progress and comments are welcome. Unfortunately, Claudia and Jürgen are in the audience, so really do feel free to ask questions in the Q&A, and they'll be able to answer, some live, some maybe they'll defer, and I can answer at the end. Okay, so why are we interested in this? Well, a lot of literature on intergenerational mobility has focused on the link between the father and typically the son's income or socioeconomic status. And there are some studies that look at the link between, son's family income and father's family income, but there isn't sort of a lot of thought about, whether those things are the same or, should they be the same or not. And really the question that we're asking is, what is the role of mothers in the transmission of economic status across generations? And in particular, we ask whether the entry of women into the labor force can affect the degree of intergenerational transmission. Okay, and so what is the motivation for this? Well, many of you have probably seen this graph. This is based on work by Miles Korak. It's called I think Alan Kruger dubbed it the Great Gatsby curve. He basically shows a sort of cross-country relationship between the Gini coefficient on the horizontal axis and the coefficient of intergenerational elasticity, or IGE. And this is something we're going to talk a lot about in this talk. Okay, so what is the IGE? The intergenerational elasticity is simply the regression of the coefficient in regression of son's earnings on log son's earnings on log parents' earnings. And what you see in this graph is that across countries there's a strong positive relationship between inequality and the coefficient of intergenerational elasticity. So the higher the intergenerational elasticity, it means that the more strongly correlated are children's outcomes to parents' outcomes, so there's less mobility in society. And when Alan Kruger presented this, I think at the Council of Economic Advisors, he raised the question that perhaps when in countries that have we worry about inequality because we also worry about inequality of opportunity, that countries that are very unequal, it's also more difficult for children to rise the educational ladder. Okay, so you see here countries that are very unequal and that are high intergenerational elasticity. A lot of countries in South America, the Scandinavian countries tend to be here at the bottom, and the other Western countries tend to be sort of somewhere in the middle. And this pattern is something that shows up in other data sets as well. So this is data from the Chetty et al. Inequality of opportunity, equality of opportunity insights data set. So this is just across commuting zones. You can calculate the the Gini coefficient on the horizontal axis in a commuting zone, and the rank slope, this sort of measure of relative mobility. And there's a sort of strong positive relationship, a t statistic of about 20. This is a bin scatter plot, but the relationship is is very strong. And we also see a similar relationship in Norway. So this is sort of most of the data we're going to be using in this presentation. We've broken here things down by three different sort of mini cohorts, people born in the sort of 1960s, 1970s, and the 1980s. And the relationship is there. It's not sometimes it's a bit stronger than in other cases, but there seems to be this positive relationship between inequality and intergenerational elasticity coefficient. Okay, so that's interesting, as it raises the question that perhaps more unequal societies also have lower mobility. And the next question is, well, if inequality has gone up so much in recent years, then it's probably also true that the IgE, or the degree of mobility, the IgE has gone up and the degree of mobility has gone down. But it turns out, at least in the US, that this result is much less clear and not so obvious. So there are a couple of papers, again, by the Chetty et al. Team, and also one by Nathaniel Hilger, where they basically don't find any relationship. They don't find that the intergenerational elasticity coefficient has risen over time, but there's different work by Davis and Mazumder that actually do find a decrease in mobility. Let me show you what happened in Norway. So the left-hand panel here is a graph on the evolution of the Gini coefficient based on some sort of recent work by my co-author Jorgen and Auberg and Atkinson. The right-hand panel is our own calculations using Norwegian registry data on the father-son intergenerational elasticity coefficient. Okay, and essentially what I want you to show is that these cohorts born between 1965 and 1975, they experienced this sort of sharp drop in the intergenerational elasticity coefficient, but at the same time, so these are cohorts that would typically sort of be in the labor market, or the time that we measure the the child's income is when these cohorts are in their say early 30s, and they're actually seeing this increase in inequality. So in the time series, it actually doesn't look as if there is a great Gatsby curve. There seems to be, if anything, in this data, a negative relationship between elasticity and income inequality. Okay, so what was going on for these cohorts? Well, this probably comes as no surprise. This is just female labor force participation rates. The orange line is for all women from the labor force surveys. The green line is women mothers of children who were age 5 from the the registry data, and you see that there is this sort of sharp increase in female labor force participation rate, which is particularly pronounced among mothers of young children. Okay, so this is sort of well known in a lot of countries in the Western world, and also in Norway. Okay, so the question that we're asking is that is it possible that women's entry into the labor force has weakened the relationship between inequality and mobility? And because we're in COVID times, we were thinking about titling the paper "Flattening the Great Gatsby Curve," but we're willing to take suggestions on this. Okay, so why would this matter? So that was just like a sort of a long-winded introduction, but let's think why this thing could matter. And our basic premise is that child human capital is going to be a function of both parental resources but also time inputs. And so what happens to the intergenerational elasticity when women enter the labor force? Well, in the typical intergenerational regression, we are essentially omitting some important variables. Okay, we're omitting the woman's income, and we're omitting the woman and the man's time inputs. And it turns out that the answer depends on a lot of factors. It depends on the degree of assortative mating. It depends on the elasticities of labor supply, both with respect to, say, unearned income or husband's income, and also with respect to own wage. And it also depends on the child human capital production function, on the relative importance of time and money inputs, and on the elasticity of substitution between time and money inputs. And I'm going to sort of illustrate how these things work in a second. Okay, so what we do in this paper, we're going to illustrate, theoretically, the link between the female labor force participation rate and the IgE. We're going to start with what we call a statistical model, where there's no real optimizing behavior. We just sort of write down the the IgE regression equation, and then see what happens when women enter the labor force, especially in terms of this sort of bias of the IgE coefficient. And then we build on that by developing a sort of a model of intergenerational transmission, and we develop a quantitative analysis that includes sort of the marriage market, includes this sort of child human capital production function, and do some comparative statics to understand how the the IgE changes over time as women enter the labor force. And finally, we do some sort of very basic reduced form analysis using this Norwegian registry data. Looking at the sort of the reduced form link between intergenerational elasticity and female labor force participation, and also the link between IgE and the rollout of universal childcare, which you can think of as an exogenous shock to female labor force participation. Okay, so let's start with this statistical model. So let's say that this is sort of the true regression equation linking the child's log income, y prime m, log y prime m, to the father's log income, that's log ym. Okay, but we think that child's income is also affected by mother's income, and by, it should say here, sort of mother's and father's time input. We're going to make here already one important assumption, is that the father supplies labor inelastic. Okay, so it's only sort of the mother's time spent with children that matters for human capital accumulation, because just the father is devoting all of his time to work. Okay, so again, these time inputs matter for human capital. The assumption is that father supplies labor inelastically, and the mother divides her time between labor and child rearing, which we're going to call H. And the mother's human capital is going to affect both her own wages and her productivity in child rearing. Okay, so this is what we mean. What are the two inputs? What is mother's income? That's very straightforward. It's her wage, which depends on her human capital, times the amount that she's not spending in child rearing, so just the time that she spends in market production. And the mother's child rearing also depends on, is equal to the time that she spends in sort of child rearing, but that's multiplied by this sort of productivity term, which also depends on her human capital. Okay, we're going to make sort of standard assumptions, or quasi-standard assumptions about this child rearing, the supply of child rearing time. So basically, there's a positive income elasticity, but there's also a negative wage elasticity. So we're basically just saying that the substitution effects here dominate income effects, which I think is it's an okay assumption to make. Okay, so now what happens when mothers enter the labor force? Let's start with a world in which you have random matching. Okay, which we know that's not true, but it really sort of helps to illustrate some of the factors at work. Okay, so with random matching, what happens is that W, which is the woman's wage, and Q, which is the woman's productivity in child rearing, are uncorrelated with YM, with the husband's income. Okay, that's the nature of random matching, that people just marry at random. Okay, so what we're going to do is going to first derive the IgE, assuming that women don't work at all, and we're going to call that IgE RM0, and then compare that to the estimate of the IgE when women enter the labor force, and we're going to call that IgE RM1. Okay, and I won't go through all the algebra, but basically you get that with random matching and woman not participating into the labor force, then the typical father-son elasticity is going to be capture exactly the coefficient eta 1. But when women enter the labor force, the IgE is going to be equal to this parameter eta 1 plus a second term, which we can call sort of a bias term, okay, which depends on the the covariance between the time spent in child rearing H and husband's income, but also on the relative productivity of time versus money. Okay, so eta 3 is the coefficient on time inputs, and eta 2 is the coefficient on money inputs. And what's important here is that this covariance is definitely positive. Okay, because of random matching, the only way that H is correlated with YM is through the fact that wives of higher earning husbands spend less time in the market. Okay, so that's just a simple, straightforward income elasticity. Okay. All right. So, but the result here is, with random matching, the woman's entry into the labor force can bias the IGE in either direction, depending on the sign of this middle term. Okay, of eta 3 minus E2, minus eta 2. Okay, so it depends on the relative importance of time and money. And the intuition here is that high-income men marry women that can be either low or high human capital, but the income effect makes them work less, as I just said, and so they spend more time in child rearing. Now, if time spent with children is relatively more important than the money input, then the IGE is driven upwards, relative to the case with women who are not working, and vice versa if money is more important. Okay, so this is just sort of to illustrate, the way in which these forces operate in the case of random matching. What happens if you introduce assortative matching? Well, now it's no longer true that that covariance between log ym and h is always unambiguously positive, because now you also have that high income men may be are probably matched to women who have high human capital, so earn higher wages and are more productive in child rearing. Okay, so the assortative mating, sorry, the intergenerational, the IGE coefficient is going to be higher than in the case with random matching. That's probably something that conforms to most of our intuition. Women, even if women don't work, high-income men are married to women who are more productive in child rearing. Okay, and when women work, now you have a term that the IGE is equal to the the baseline IGE when women don't work plus 2 terms. This third term mirrors the one that we had seen before, but now this covariance can be either positive or negative depending on whether you have positive or negative selection of women into the labor force. And now you also have this additional term, which depends on the strength of assortative mating with respect to market productivity versus the strength of assortative mating with respect to home productivity. Okay, so the answer is that basically entry of women into the labor force can drive the IGE coefficient either upwards or downwards depending on the strength of these different coefficients. Okay, and this slide I'm just sort of repeating what I just said. Okay, so that's a summary. We have this rich set of predictions for the effect on the increase in FLFP on intergenerational elasticity. Ultimately, the sign of the effect of is an empirical question. What we're going to do first is we're going to do a semi-calibration, which I think sort of in the long run will try to become a full calibration, and study how the IGE changes as we introduce shocks, and then we're going to do some reduced form analysis. All right. So this is our sort of theoretical framework. We basically set up a model which is an extension of Becker-Tomes, but also includes mother's labor supply and time investments in human capital. It includes the fact that the children's human capital depends on the human capital of both fathers and mothers. And we have a sort of flexible model of the marriage market that has sort of both random matching and perfect assortative matching as polar cases. And our goal is to derive the IGE as a function of the model parameters. All right, so the framework is very straightforward. So the household maximizes utility. It derives utility from its own consumption. We're going to assume here a unitary, decision-making household. So Cobb-Douglas preferences depends on its own consumption, and this index of the child's human capital, which is really a combination of, both the sort of direct descendant, let's say the son, but also of the human capital of, in this case, the daughter-in-law. Okay, but the model is actually applies both to households that have male children and female children. We're going to introduce here a sort of fixed cost of work parameter. This is mostly for calibration purposes, and there's a budget constraint which says that the total consumption plus how much you invest in this investment good, in this sort of, money input into the child's human capital, has to be sort of smaller than total income, okay, where total income is total man's income, which again, we assume here inelastic labor supply, so that's just equal to YM. And woman's income is her sort of baseline wage, which we call YF, but that's sort of multiplied by how much she works. Okay, this is the marriage market. Essentially, we say, look, men and women match based on this index, which is a combination of their own human capital and this sort of shock V. And this model is sort of very flexible, because if the variance of the shock is 0, then we're basically saying that there is, perfect assortative mating. And if the variance of these shock of these V variables are, tend to infinity, then essentially we have random matching. Okay. And this is sort of the key other element of the model. It's the the constraints. So this is the child human capital production function. We're going to assume here a constant elasticity of substitution. I think I forgot some exponent over here, but it's there in the derivation. And essentially, we're saying child's human capital depends on the time input H and on the money input I. And both the time and money inputs are augmented by the parent's human capital. Okay, so that's really sort of capturing the fact that, perhaps sort of, higher human capital parents are better able to, they transmit more human capital to their children when they spend time with them, but they may perhaps also know how to spend their money better. That's why sort of these coefficients come in here. Okay, and then sort of we have earnings per unit of time, and this is just a sort of traditional formulation that earnings depend on the children's human capital. Okay, so we can solve the model, and we can derive a formula for the child's log income. That's log y prime m. It's going to be equal to a constant. It's going to be a function of sort of total potential family income, and then it's going to be a function of this sort of CES aggregate of the human capital and the price of the input and the price of child rearing, if you want, which is sort of the woman's potential wage. Now, typically there's no closed form solution for this IGE formula other than under very specific combinations of parameter values. Plus we can have corner solutions. Really, if you want to make some progress, we have to do some simulations, and that's what we're going to do next. So we're going to use simulations to analyze the behavior of the IGE as female labor force participation increases. And we'll consider here sort of 3 comparative statics exercises. One is a decrease in the price of the market good P. And the way we're really thinking of this is tied to the expansion of public universal childcare that happened in Norway in the 1970s. We can also see what happens when there's a decrease in the fixed cost of work kappa. So think of it as a change in gender norms that now make it sort of more acceptable for women to work outside of the house. And finally, increase in female returns to human capital gamma F. So think of it something as perhaps female bias technical change, or a shift in the industrial composition from, say, more manufacturing to sort of more of a service-oriented economy that increases sort of women's returns to human capital. Okay, so these are sort of the type of calibration exercise that we do. So first is what happens if there's a change in the price of the market good. So P, we make it go from something that is sort of very expensive to something that is sort of much less expensive. You see that the female labor force participation goes up from about 20% to about 40%. Again, this is not a sort of an exact calibration. It's really more to get an idea of how these things change. Okay, what happens when women join the labor force? The intergenerational elasticity coefficient in this case goes up from 0.4 to 0.6. Okay, so that's a pretty substantial increase in the intergenerational elasticity, or a pretty substantial decrease in mobility. But what if sort of the woman's entry into the labor market is driven by a change in the fixed cost of work? Well, you get sort of a similar increase in female labor force participation, but the increase in the IGE is much more modest. Okay, and what happens if there are changes in returns to human capital? Well, here it sort of depends how we choose some of the other parameter values. Okay, so in this case, if the mother's human capital is very important for the time input, but not important at all for the money input, we have pretty much not much happening to the IGE, perhaps even a hump-shaped relationship. But if the opposite is true, if these parameters are chosen in a different way, we can get sort of, again, a similar increase in female labor force participation, but actually a sharp decrease in the IG. Okay, so the point is that, again,
you're at the 25-minute mark. Just wanted to.
All right, thank you. So the point is that the IGE can either rise or fall with women entering the labor force. The next steps that we haven't done yet and that we're sort of planning to do is to do a more formal calibration, also look at sort of the long run dynamics as, say, an economy shifts from a world with, say, low returns to human capital to high returns to human capital, or something like that. Okay, so let me use these last few minutes to do a little bit on the reduced form analysis. So this alternative approach essentially look at the reduced form relationship between the IGE and female labor force participation. We're going to just look at sort of the this correlation between IGE and FLFP, and also this sort of quasi-exogenous drivers of FLFP. So the rollout of universal childcare in Norway. Okay, and essentially we're going to exploit variation across Norwegian counties and cohorts born between 1967 and 1984. Okay, so let's start with the relationship between the IGE, that's on the vertical axis, and female labor force participation. So here we're sort of, in this graph, we're pooling together all, or just sort of, these three representative cohorts. What you see quite clearly is this sort of, sharp increase in the labor force participation rate. So the red points, the red triangles are the 1960s cohort, the black squares are the 1970s cohort, the blue circles are the 1980s cohort. And if you pool everything together, there seems to be sort of this mild negative relationship. Okay, so remember the flattening of the Great Gatsby curve, that the IG is actually going down as women enter the labor force. But if you look within cohorts, it's a little bit difficult to say, but if anything, there maybe looks to be a positive relationship. Okay, and when we do sort of a regression, sort of separately for each cohort, or pooling all the data together, or just including cohort dummies, that's where you see this positive relationship. If you include both cohort dummies and county dummies, there seems to be a negative relationship between female labor force participation and the IG. Okay, so that's the first result. What about sort of this sort of quasi-exogenous change? So universal daycare, notice that for the 60s cohort, there was basically almost no universal daycare. For the 70s cohort, there's where you see a lot of variation and also a sort of pretty strong positive relationship, and something a little bit more mixed in the 1980s cohort. But again, if you pool everything together, there seems to be a mild negative relationship. And here you get this sort of different pattern that, again, when you pool all cohorts together and include both cohort dummies and county dummies, there seems to be, if anything, a positive relationship between the IGE and the expansion of childcare, which is consistent with that comparative statics exercise that we showed before. What happens when we reduce the time, sorry, the price of the money input? That's sort of our, it's mimicking this, expansion of universal data. Okay, so that's pretty much it. So that the summary is that we see in Norway that the intergenerational elasticity has declined over time, even during a period when inequalities seem to be rising. There seems to be a mild negative association between female labor force participation and the IGE, but the rollout of universal childcare is associated with an increase in the IGE as predicted by the model. So we suspect that the source of the decline in the intergenerational elasticity is probably to be found elsewhere, and we're still looking. And we thank you for comments and suggestions and remarks. Thank you very much.
Thanks so much, Daniele. We have a question from Kelly Voster, who's asking, what is the income measure used for the IGEs that are negatively related to female labor force participation, for example, men's labor earnings?
Yes, so I think that Jürgen can correct me if he knows better, but my understanding is that yes, we're using men's labor earnings. We're not including other forces of earnings. Yes.
Thanks. And another question from Pen Pen Xiao. Do marriages become more and more authoritative over time? And how much does that contribute to overall inequality in Norway?
So this is a little bit of a contentious question, and I know that from data in the US, there's been sort of some debate about exactly this point, whether I think what's a little bit contentious is both the premise, is it true that there's been an increase in assortativeness over time, and the second point of debate is whether sort of the increased assortativeness has led to more overall inequality. I don't have the answer specifically for Norway off the top of my head, so something that we'll definitely have to look into. And I think that's something that we plan to do as we move towards a sort of more full calibration of the model, is to also try to match the patterns of assortativeness in marriages. The calibrations that I showed you, I assumed perfect assortative mating, which is obviously an extreme case, but it's something, it's one of the parameters that we can sort of definitely play with to get sort of more realistic results.
Thanks. Another question from Brad Hirschbein. As women work more and contribute more to family earnings, does an IGE based on father's earnings alone become a less useful statistic? If the IGE is based on family income in both cases, would that help make a better calibration?
So I think that's a very good point. And we have also calculated various measures of the IGE based on family earnings that I didn't show you here. There seems to be a sort of negative trend in the IGE of child's income with respect to family earnings as well. And in the sort of the model as well, we can do that, and we can actually show that there's still going to be a bias. So I think you're exactly right. You're exactly capturing the intuition, Brad, that that's exactly the point. We basically have this sort of omitted variable, which is mother's earnings, and perhaps things would look sort of better if we just control for family earnings in the regression. But that alone does not sort of solve that kind of omitted variable bias, and I can sort of expand on that sort of later if you want.
Audience, feel free to add more questions since we have a few more minutes. In the meantime, maybe I can see if other presenters, other panelists have questions.
So my co-authors in the chat answered that assortative mating is constant in Norway. So that was in answer to Peng's question. So thank you.
Maybe I'll jump in and ask something very quick myself, which is I wanted to ask if you thought also about another related trend, which is the change in women's education. So the fact that the human capital of the women is also systematically changing, and over time, and in particular, if we think that changes in education will not only affect the women's productivity in the labor market, but maybe possibly also in how they contribute to their children's human capital. And yeah, so so maybe you've seen literature about this, that I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that that's another sort of comparative statics that we can definitely look at. I suspect that it would have a similar effect to what we found for an increase in the returns to women's human capital. I would have to work it out, sort of, the full thing to, make a more definite statement about that. But I think that's definitely something that is worth looking at as well. So thank you.
Thanks, Daniel. We can wait maybe a couple minutes, see more questions come up, and then switch to our next presenter in a few minutes. It's great though, we've had a very active audience compared to most sessions I've seen.
Yeah, thank you to the audience.
Matthias, since we have maybe one, a couple more questions actually. Yeah, I have
yes. Yeah, I saw the question in the Q&A. So
yeah.
whether
will you be including daughters' earnings as well when calculating the IGE?
So again, I think that this is we can do it, and we've done sort of some preliminary analysis looking at sort of total family income of the child generation, and we've done it for total family income of the son's generation and total family income of the daughter's generation. So you can do that sort of separately. We can definitely do these things, and I think that probably in the introduction, and we show these trends, we should probably present a little bit more of these overall patterns, not just sort of father son, but father son and daughter, father daughter, et cetera, et cetera. So, but this is definitely something that we can include. So again, thanks for the suggestion.
One more question by Pen Xiao. If the relative productivity of time input is higher than that of money input, will that likely lead to lower IG as female labor force participation goes up? What in the data help to pin down this relative productivity?
I'm reading the question, Pen.
Yeah, sorry, no, so maybe my reading is
So, yeah, I mean, I think that's it's a good question. I think that we do have there are something in the data that we can use for thinking about the productivity of sort of the money input. So again, thinking of what happens to, say, children's education or test scores when when you say roll out universal daycare, which is something that sort of changes the quantity of time input. So I think that it's definitely something that we need to think about, and we can make sort of guesstimates of what those parameters are, but I think that it would be sort of definitely a good idea to try to come up with estimates that are not based on guesswork and that are based on data. So that's a very good point. Thank you.
Great. I hope that I've captured all the questions, because somehow they're sorted in a funny way on my own list, but I think we have them all. So unless our presenters have another question they want to ask, we can leave the floor to Matthias Döpke for the last presentation, and thanks.
Yes, so thanks everybody for being here. I'm very happy to be part of this exciting session. Very interesting papers. I have some comments on the other papers too, if you have time at the end. And it's a very coherent set of issues, because some of what I'm talking about will also relate to some of what we have seen before. So we all know we are in the middle of a pandemic. The pandemic has dire health consequences, but the pandemic has also brought about very fundamental changes in work life and family life. Most of us are sitting at home right now, working out, in my case, from the basement or a spare bedroom. So work and family life are not as separated as they usually are. You will probably at some point see one of my kids step through the door behind me and have some questions. So there's also some interference between these two spheres of our lives. And as we have seen in the first paper, there's still a lot of inequality in who does most of those family responsibilities, most of these childcare responsibilities, which can also suggest that the impact of these fundamental changes are unequal between women and men, between mothers and fathers. So this means that the impact of this crisis on the labor market is quite different from that of a regular recession. And this research program that we're doing here is trying to work out, well, what are the implications of this, that we have a recession that looks quite different in its impact on women's versus men's labor market compared to regular recessions. I think it's an important question because regular recessions are in some ways quite irregular. There's a bunch of stylized facts about business cycles that macroeconomists have used to formulate their models. There's a bunch of things that are always the same about economic downturns. And we're arguing here, this time it's different. And we're trying to understand in what particular ways is it different and how does it matter. So this is joint work with Tyton Alon at UCSD. Our student, Northwestern student, Jane Olmsted-Ramsey. I hope you're interviewing her today somewhere on Zoom. And my longtime co-author, Michelle Tertelt from Mannheim. So this is a project that is kind of evolving like most research on the crisis. So this has a bunch of different steps to it. We started back in March of last year to write about the likely impact of the COVID crisis on women's labor market, the gender inequality, mostly based on pre-crisis data on things like the distribution of childcare responsibilities. It was clear that because of school closures, childcare would be a major issue. And so we just documented who's actually taking care of children. What is that going to imply for the impact on the labor market? We also documented facts on telecommuting, who's able to work from home, how is this going to matter? So this was essentially more prospective, but based on what we already knew about what the world is like. Today, I want to talk mostly about the second step. So I won't talk a lot about the data, but I want to talk today about the second paper, which is about the macroeconomic implications. And so we have regular business cycle models, but now we have a crisis that has a very different nature. We want to work out how does it matter that you have this differential impact on women versus men in the labor market. Currently, we're working on the third step, which is to look at microdata from a bunch of different countries to see how this impact on the labor market is really quite different across countries. So some of these facts, such as that women have been more affected, have been documented in many countries already by many teams of authors. But there's really quite a bit of variation in how large these differences are, or if they are there in the first place. So there are some countries where the gap in gender is quite gaping. In other countries, such as Sweden, for example, it's much smaller. And those things relate naturally to differences to some extent in policies, such as the extent of school closures, but also institutions, for example, these furlough institutions that in some countries replace lost income in a fairly automatic fashion, so leading to much lower level of layoffs and much lower unemployment rates. And so they were trying to figure out this international picture with a lot more data. But today we will focus more on this from a macro theory perspective. How does it matter for the nature of a business cycle if you have this very different nature of a shock? Okay, so for this paper, the starting point is the observation that in recent decades, regular recessions, so pre-COVID recessions, have been what's now known as man sessions. Man sessions, because regular recessions have a much bigger impact on men's employment compared to women's employment. And one reason for that is that regular recessions are concentrated in certain sectors, such as manufacturing and construction, and those happen to be sectors where many men work. And so many more men get unemployed when activity slows down in a recession. So now we have a new recession, but it's quite different. And we argue it's quite different for two reasons. One is the distribution of sectors. As I said, usually things like construction and manufacturing are the most affected. This time, it is sectors that are contact intensive, sectors where you have a lot of direct contact with other people, and therefore there's a high infection risk and therefore a high reduction in activity. Things like restaurants, gyms, anything that's a contact intensive service sector, those sectors have the largest contraction in employment, and those sectors have much higher female employment shares compared to these traditional cyclical sectors such as construction and manufacturing. So that's the first reason. More women than usual are kind of just getting laid off in the recession. The second one is childcare. So we also have that schools shut down. We have that daycares shut down. We also have that informal childcare is less available because, say, grandma can't come over because of the high infection risk in this crisis. So much more so than usual, parents really have to take care of their kids, not just a few hours per day, but really most of the day. And so parents are therefore much more affected than usual. And parents, of course, includes both women and men. But as we have seen in the first paper, even today, women do the majority of childcare and therefore also more exposed to the shock. To some extent because there's more single moms than single dads, but also because even among say married couples raising kids together, there's still a fairly uneven division of labor. So these things combine to give you a bigger impact on women in the labor market. And then the question is what that's going to do to the economy at large. So in this paper, in this presentation, I will not talk much about the data. I should say, we are just one of many papers on this issue. There's many empirical papers that have looked at this to some extent with existing data, CPS and so on. Other papers have done their own surveys, use a lot of data by Abby Adams, Prassel at Oxford, and the larger research team that did surveys in the UK, in Germany, and in the United States. But all of these different studies show you the same fact that the COVID-19 recession had a much bigger impact on women compared to men. Here we're just showing you one indicator of this. So this picture shows you the rise in women's and men's unemployment, in particular the difference between those two. So a positive number here means women's unemployment goes up more than that of men. A negative number means men's unemployment goes up more. So negative means man session. A positive number means a she session. What you see here is that if you look over the last 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 recessions before COVID, all of those were man sessions where men lost more jobs, particularly large in the Great Recession of 2007 to 2009. It was kind of small in 2001, but then it was a recession with relatively small rise in unemployment overall. So it had the same basic pattern. Then you come to 2020, and here you see that the rise in unemployment in the United States was 3 percentage points higher for women than for men. So it was, first of all, the opposite sign, and also the absolute value bigger than anything that had come before. There never had been a recession that has affected one gender so much more than the other. And in this case, it was women who had the bigger impact compared to men. So this is unemployment. If you look at participation, you see sometimes even larger effects. So also a larger reduction in hours, because of course some of this reduction in work is not measured as unemployment. If you voluntarily quit your job because you have to take care of your kids, it doesn't always get counted as unemployment. Depends a bit on which state you live in, but there's certainly a gap between those measures. So we have a she session, and that is true in a number of countries, not in every single country. For example, in Germany, in Sweden, it's relatively small. There's also different institutions there, so that's something to be discussed in a different paper. Okay, so we want to talk about, how does this matter? What's the difference of this impact? Obviously, there's an impact on welfare. So now different people will suffer from the recession. In particular, single moms, single parents are going to be very highly exposed to this recession, more so than usual. But beyond this impact on welfare, we want to ask what difference does it make for the nature of the recession? Is it really just the same thing with a signs reverse? So everything is the same, it's just women as opposed to men suffering? Or is there something qualitatively different if you have a larger impact on women? And so the main point of the paper really is to argue, yes, there's a qualitative difference. And that is because women's and men's labor supply really has a different nature. That there's a difference in between how women and men adjust labor supply over the cycle. And this means that shocks to either one have different qualitative implications. In particular, we're going to argue that it matters for amplification. We're going to argue that this large impact on women reduces the scope of households to self-insure against shocks. And this will potentially lead to a stronger transmission from income to consumption, and therefore potentially magnify the shock and prolong the recession. So that is one macro implication. There's also new dimensions of policy, because we argue that childcare is important. Matters closures of schools and daycares will have a big impact here. And finally, we can also think about longer-run implications. So we're also going to trace out how this shock affects gender inequality in the years after recession. See how the gender gap responds, and to some extent, this is driven by the typical effect of losing a job in a recession, where you lose experience. You may not be able to get back the same job, so you may have persistently lower earnings, and this affects this time women more so than men. But potentially, there's also long repercussions of some of the more persistent changes that come about because of the recession. Think of remote work. Now we're all on Zoom. I sincerely hope we won't be all on Zoom 1 year from now, but it's pretty clear that some of this change in work organization is going to change. So many companies are already saying that working from home will become a much more widely available option even after the crisis compared to what it was before. And that does matter actually a lot for the labor market, because we know from pre-existing data that job flexibility has a big impact on the ability to kind of combine career objectives and raising a family, and therefore some impact on gender inequality also. So we're also going to trace out some of those long-run effects. Okay, so that's roughly the scope of what we want to do, and we're going to use a quantitative model to assess those effects. Okay, just a couple of words of literature we relate to. So, it's a paper specifically on this particular recession, but I think it links most importantly to a fairly new but growing literature on the role of female labor supply in business cycles. Traditional business cycle models don't really distinguish male and female labor supply, and there's recently a set of papers that argue this distinction is really important. First of all, because male and female labor supply is qualitatively different, it behaves differently, and also because it has been changing a lot over time. There's a large rise in female participation over recent decades, which suggests the nature of aggregate labor supply today is quite different from what it was in 1970 or 1950. And so Stefania Albanese has done a lot of the work on this, and there are some other recent papers also making similar points. We wrote a bit about this in our handbook chapter a few years ago. So there's one literature coming from macro, and then more from structural labor. There's this literature on family risk sharing, the extent to which families can absorb shocks, not just through savings, for example, as in the usual representative agent model, but also through sharing risk in the family. For example, through this possibility that one spouse loses a job and then the other spouse maybe increases hours or joins the labor force to compensate for this risk. There's a number of papers that try to characterize how important is this family risk-sharing mechanism. Blundell, Pistafari, and Saporto-Exton, for example, argue that this risk-sharing in the family actually is more important than self-insurance through saving, which is the channel that's mostly emphasized in the macro literature. And so we're also trying to bring this family insurance more into macro model. And lastly, there's now a very large literature on macro implications of this current recession. Of course, we also link to this in particular to papers on the labor market impact of that recession. Okay, but coming back to what we want to do. So we want to think about what is the qualitative difference of this different shock, this larger shock on women compared to men, on how the economy reacts to an economic downturn. We're going to do this by essentially building a model of the household side of the macro economy. Okay, so it's a macro model, but we essentially leave the production side reduced form and really focus on the question, how does a shock from the outside transmit through the household sector? Because this is where the action is going to be for us. Now, if you want to have a complete GE macro model, you can add your favorite production function and maybe some sticky prices. So it's not hard to do, but really the nature of this paper is primarily about the household sector. So we focus on that. Okay, so what are the ingredients that we're going to have? So we're going to have different types of people: single women, single men, couples. Some will have children, K for kids, and these children will generate childcare needs. Childcare obviously is important given this issue of school closure. The labor market is what we are interested in the labor market will be primarily extensive margin, because that's where most of the action is. So you can either work or not. However, we do allow a choice between part-time and full-time work. Now, and this choice is there to some extent because many women do work part-time. In particular, many mothers work part-time. So you kind of want to have that to match the data. It's also there because it gives you at least a little bit of an intensive margin, because you can switch from part-time to full-time. And this is one of these adjustments that is important for family insurance. There's going to be accumulation of experience. If you work more, you get more work experience. And this is going to be important for tracing out impacts on the gender gap. There's going to be occupations. The only thing about occupation we're going to care about in this model is whether or not you can work from home. Now, because in the current crisis, it's very clear that being able to work from home makes taking care of the kids much easier. And so this is something that we felt is crucial to capture here. Of course, you could do more, but for us, it's really just, can you work from home or not? There's going to be division of labor in the household. To some extent, it's driven by optimal specialization. So if one spouse has a higher wage, they're more likely to work more. But it's also going to be driven in part by a social norm. So some of our couples, we're going to call them the traditional couples, will have the social norm that essentially favors the mother doing more of the childcare. This is just to match the observation that that Petra already mentioned earlier, that even if you look at couples that are kind of similar, both working full time, for example, even there you find that mothers today still do the majority of the childcare. And because this paper really is about childcare to some extent, we do want to match those numbers, and we do it by including the social norm. Okay, so that's kind of what happens in the household sector. There's an aggregate state, so the aggregate economy can be in a normal state, everything's fine. It can be in a recession, think of the Great Recession, like a normal recession where men lose jobs. It can be in a pandemic, which is where we have this childcare shock and more job losses for women. And finally, it can be in the new normal. The new normal is where we go to after pandemic. And new normal here means we're going to let some of the changes that come around in the pandemic persist afterwards. In particular, more ability to telecommute, more jobs that you can do from home will be one of the things that show up. Now, this model, even though it's about COVID, doesn't have infections. It's not one of those infection models that now many economists are working on. We are going to just model this more indirectly as a shock to the labor market. So there's going to be a higher probability of losing a job, a lower probability of finding a job, and a shock to childcare needs. So essentially, it's school closures plus a shock to the labor market. Okay, so our people don't get sick, but they are affected, like all of us are, by the more aggregate implications of this shock. Okay, I won't show you the model in full detail. I'll just show you 2 slides with decision problems just to show you kind of roughly what this looks like. So here's a decision problem for a single who is working. So value functions here have assets, human capital, kids, occupation, and the aggregate state. And these are E for employed, G for gender, because you could be a single female or single male. And what you decide, what you care about is your consumption and your leisure. So it's kind of usual macro type consumption leisure preferences. You have discounting for tomorrow, and you have some probability of death. And so this is people live forever, but they have a constant probability of death. One of these perpetual youth models where some new people come in every period to get a bit of cohort effects in here. There's a budget constraint, so consumption plus savings is income plus savings. So that's, again, what you would find in most macro models. We allow for increasing or decreasing returns to scale from working part-time or full-time here. That's a theta parameter. That's useful to match the fraction of part-time work. And then more importantly, there's the time constraint. Okay, so that's kind of really where this deviates from kind of the most basic standard macro model, is that you have to take care of your kids. So gamma kx is how much time it takes to raise your kids. K is a state variable for kids. We just distinguish little kids and big kids. Petra mentioned teenagers are not as much work. It's also true in our model. So if you have a kid under the age of 10, it's going to create a lot of work. Older kids, not so much work. Once they're out of school, they're no longer a part of your time budget constraint. So this is just a number you have to meet. You can meet it by just spending time T on childcare. But then there's this other thing over here. And this thing is the impact of telecommuting. So what this essentially says is that if you have a job where you can telecommute, where you can work from home, so if occupation is telecommutable, then you get some fraction of your time to use for both work and for childcare. Okay, So you may have seen the door behind me open a few minutes ago. A kid walked in, so nowadays you can be on Zoom and still kind of be in charge of the kids, which you wouldn't be able to if you have to go to a physical workplace, if you have to be at the factory. Then you have to get somebody else to provide those services. Okay, so the ones who can work from home have a bonus for childcare, and that's ultimately matched to match some observations on the impact of having a flexible job on the distribution of childcare. Okay, so that's the new constraint, and then you just have a time constraint that says leisure plus labor plus childcare equals your time endowment. Okay, so that's what you decide on if you have a job. There's also kind of a beginning of period state where you have a potential job offer. Then you decide whether or not to accept that offer. Now, some people might not take a job because they are rich and they'd rather have more leisure. Some people might not take a job because they have very high childcare needs, especially in particular within the recession, and so they really don't have the time to take a job. So endogenous job acceptance is also part of the story. Okay, those were our singles. Our married couples are really quite similar. So these are going to be cooperative couples. They just solve they maximize the weighted average of her utility. This is female utility here, and his utility, male utility over here. There's no divorce, there's no change in bargaining as in other Sanders models, so it's really fairly simplified on this dimension. There's some bargaining weight that ultimately is useful to match labor and leisure for couples. So this is essentially just everything multiplied by 2. So you have now 2 utility functions in here. In the budget constraint, you have 2 incomes from him and from her if both are working. You have the childcare bonus for both if both are telecommuting, and you have 2 time constraints. The only thing that's really different is now this social norm. So if you have, if you're traditional, so if modern is turned off, so if you have this thing turned on, then you have essentially a penalty in your utility if the father does more childcare than the mother and the other way around. Okay, so essentially we just hardwire that these couples prefer on the margin that the mother does a bit more of the childcare. And it's really just a way of getting the allocation of childcare in the model to be as in the data, where women do a lot more of the work, even if they're both working full time, even if they have similar wages. Okay, so it's what gets us close to the data here. It's also what allows us to see what would happen if social norms change, because you might think that one possibility we entertain is that there's a huge childcare shock where all of a sudden everybody is aware that children are causing a lot of work, that it might shift some social norms, might make them a bit accelerate this pre-existing change to more equal, gender equal norms, and so we can also trace out how that would affect outcomes. Okay, so that is the decision problem once you have accepted jobs, and again there's a previous stage where you have job offers. You decide who, if anybody, should accept these job offers. So that's the nature of the model. It's a model of the household sector. It kind of looks, kind of the core of that is the usual macro model, but it's extended by having couples, by having childcare needs, and by having bargaining in the family on who does what. And particularly the bargaining is important for deciding who does how much childcare, who works full-time, who works part-time, and well, how's the household going to react if there's a shock. Now, what we want to do is to match this model to the data, and then just to throw recessions into this model. So we calibrate this model to match a bunch of evidence on labor supply, labor market flows, gender gap, returns to experience, and time use on childcare. So we do this separately for singles, for married, both working full-time, and so on. And then we throw in 2 types of recessions. These recessions are a little bit stylized because we still want to understand qualitatively what happens. It's not like a carbon copy of the actual US pandemic recession, but it's trying to capture kind of the basic nature of these different changes. So the regular recession is essentially just a lot of men lose jobs, not so many women lose jobs. The pandemic recession has now also large changes in job losses for women. So it captures this different occupation distribution that way. And it has higher childcare needs. These childcare needs are matched to data on actual childcare during the crisis, survey evidence on how much more time parents have spent on watching their kids in the crisis. What's also there is a shift in job flexibility. So we do match that now many more people are able to work from home compared to a year ago. And we also allow for social norms to shift, although this happens very slowly. So it doesn't really matter so much for the first few years, but potentially has a long run impact. Okay. And then I will just show you in the last slides what is going to happen. Kind of how is a regular recession, I think of the Great Recession of 10 years ago, different from a pandemic recession. So here you can see that. So here's the impact on women's relative labor supply. And blue is a regular recession. So here you see that in a regular recession, women's labor supply goes up compared to men. And this is what happened in 2007, 2009, when many men lost jobs. Few women did. In the pandemic recession, it's a large drop in women's relative labor supply. So this matches this evidence from the beginning that women's unemployment, women's participation drops more than that of men. This is driven to some extent by the different nature of the direct employment shock, but a lot of this comes from childcare, because now the single moms in particular, of which there are many, are very heavily affected. And even among married couples raising kids together, there is a larger impact on the mothers compared to the fathers. In fact, this shows you this here. So this is showing you labor supply.
Yes, sorry, I just want to say you're at the 25 minutes mark.
Okay, great. Yeah, no, that works perfectly. So here is broken down the change in labor supply in recessions for married couples raising kids together, separately for the fathers and mothers. And you see that in a regular recession, the labor supply drops more for the fathers than for the mothers. Now, this is because the fathers are more likely to lose their job. In the pandemic recession, even though these couples can freely decide how to allocate the labor, you see that these couples decide that about twice as much of the impact is taken by mothers as opposed to fathers. So the specialization in childcare that is prevalent before the crisis is also preserved in the crisis, and so more women take this impact. So childcare really is important for driving these changes. Now, what is this going to do? And I'll show you the summary statistic here, but I think this is kind of the maybe the most important slide just for the short-run macro implications. Then, which is the question of what is the impact of the shock on the transmission from income to consumption? So when you think about models of business cycles with any kind of nominal frictions, kind of a key issue there is always how strongly is income transmitted into consumption. The technical term is MPC. What is the marginal propensity to consume of these households? Because if you have a very high transmission from income to consumption, so if people take some loss in income and then stop consuming stuff, that means demand goes down in other sectors too, and then this whole shock gets amplified. You get a bigger recession. Okay, so really the key thing within the household sector that determines how deep a recession is going to be is this transmission from income to consumption. What we argue here is that this COVID shock, this pandemic shock, really reduces the ability of families to use family insurance to absorb the shock. And this is to some extent because usually it is women who are more flexible and who do more of this shock absorbing. And there's now a much bigger impact on women, so they're less able to do that. There's an increase in childcare, so the overall flexibility of families has gone down. And you also have that if you have, let's say a wife losing a job, most husbands are already at the maximum of labor supply. Most husbands are working full time if they can, unless they're currently laid off. So they don't really have much of a margin of an adjustment. So this family insurance works much better for when men lose jobs compared to when women lose jobs. And all these things combine to say that in this pandemic recession that is affecting women more than men, this family insurance channel just doesn't work very well. And so in the model, this shows up that the MPC, so the transmission from income to consumption, shoots up more, and it's also much more persistent. It's actually persistent long after the end of the crisis, because in the crisis, these couples run down their assets and they come up against financial constraints. And it takes quite a while to kind of save yourself out of that corner and kind of go back to where you were before. So it's a stronger transmission from income to consumption, therefore qualitatively something very different from what you see in regular recessions. Okay, last thing I will, last thing I'll talk about is gender inequality, the gender gap. So not surprisingly, because women get more unemployed in the short term, the gender gap is going to widen in the pandemic recession. This is simply the direct effect of losing a job and then having lesser job opportunities in the future. We match this to evidence on loss in future earnings from job loss in a recession, and that evidence suggests that after recession is over, you'll still have a gender gap that's about 1% wider compared to what it would have been otherwise, and just because of this larger impact on on women's job losses. So this is now 20 quarters, so it's a few years after the crisis. If you go into the very long run, so this is now at the end of this is 50 years. In the very long run, the model actually says that the gender gap ultimately will shrink because of the crisis. And this is because we do allow for some long run changes, namely we allow for a faster change in social norms. I can explain a bit more why we think that, but I'll just say it, I'll just claim it now. And maybe more importantly, we also allow for persistent change in work organization. So we allow that there's going to be more telecommutable jobs after the crisis compared to before. And this is something that's already confirmed. I mean, many employers have already said this. And in the microdata, it is very evident that whether or not you can work from home has a really big impact on the allocation of time inside the household. For example, you find that if you look at men with children who are able to work from home, who are married to women who cannot work from home, that these men do a ton more childcare compared to, say, regular husbands. And so, of course, there's some selection there, but it is suggestive of a big impact of work flexibility on dealing with work in the household. And given that we have more flexible jobs, this will make life easier for anybody who now has a lot of childcare responsibilities. And because this is more women than men, as we have seen before, and this will ultimately benefit women in the labor market and therefore lower the gender wage gap. Okay, this is pretty much what I had to say. Last point is, because much of this is driven by childcare, if you just were to prioritize school openings, of course, you would get a much smaller crisis. Now, this is kind of an obvious point, but I think it bears repeating that opening schools here is really not just about the kids, it's also about the parents, about freeing up the labor supply. So if you have a trade-off between, say, opening the schools or opening the bars and restaurants, this says, well, schools has this second order effect because you also allow the parents to do a lot more work than they would be able to otherwise. We haven't even talked about the kids yet, of course, in other work. A big issue is what happens to the children that haven't even made an appearance in this paper yet. But it's certainly, in terms of informing the trade-off, is very much in favor that prioritizing getting childcare back in order should be really high up on the list of priorities compared to some other things. Okay, I think I'll stop here. So we wanted to understand, how is this recession different from other ones? We argue one of the biggest differences is that women are much more affected than usual. So it's a bigger impact on women, which is the opposite of a normal recession. And that matters very directly for gender inequality, but we argue it matters also beyond that, for example, for the transmission from income to consumption, and therefore also for how deep the recession will be and for how persistent the effects are going to be. So I think I'll stop here. Thank you. And I'll be happy to take some questions.
Excellent. So the audience should feel free to add questions to the Q&A. And in the meantime, I have a question from one of our panelists, two of our panelists, both Daniela and Claudia. Daniela, want to go?
I'll start. Okay. Hi, Matthias. Super interesting. I have a couple of questions. One is, if in the pandemic recession going back to the new normal, you had a graph showing what happens to the gender gap, and is it goes back to the same level, or does it go back to it seemed as if it was going back to a lower level. And sorry, pandemic plus old normal. Plus, so say that there are, you have the pandemic and then we go back, there's no change in work, no change in work organization, no change in norms. And somewhat related to that, do we know from that there are, it looks as if the gender gap in the recession was quite large and sort of more than what I expected to to see, and I wasn't really sure, but maybe I just never really looked at that.
Right. Okay. Yes. So so let me start with the second part. So in the recession, indeed, the gender gap in this model grows a lot, and it's a selection effect. So what it tells you is that the women who drop out in the model have relatively higher wages compared to the women who keep on working. I believe this is primarily has to do with age. So that the women who drop out are primarily mothers. They tend to be somewhat older, therefore having already somewhat higher wages, whereas the women who stay are often young and childless, and therefore kind of at the beginning of their careers. I think in the data, we don't really have that much data. Again, I don't think it's really anywhere as pronounced as that. You know? So certainly we have to work a bit more on squaring that exactly. But in the model, it's definitely the selection on age is mostly driving that. In the long run, if you go back to the old normal, you do go back to exactly the same gender gap. It just takes a really long time, you know. And so it takes a long time because the initial impact is persistent, but it's particularly persistent for women because of the endogenous specialization. You know, so you have some women losing experience, and then because then households decide how to allocate childcare, some of those women who would have worked full-time otherwise now then go back to part-time work. And part-time work, of course, gives you a lot less returns to experience. That makes this very persistent. So for the cohort that was in the crisis, it's a decades-long effect. And so it really takes decades to go back to the old steady state because it really comes from new cohorts in the labor market.
Thank you.
Claudia?
Hi. First of all, thank you, Matthias. You know, always fascinating work, and in this case, it's quite revealing, and especially like the long run implication, because I think that's really the most scary part to some extent. So I first have a clarifying question. When you talk about a normal recession, so are you referring to it's just the 2009 recession, or is this like a regular recession? Because I thought that in some recession, you actually, you didn't have such an improvement in women's outcome. Right. So I don't know, am I wrong? Yeah.
It's so we would say that 2009 it was bigger than most, you know, but the nature was kind of regular compared to the ones before. One important distinction is that this feature of man sessions wasn't really there back in the 50s and 60s. We would say this has to do with the fact that if you go back far enough, you have a very different labor market where most women who were working were young and single, and in a way behaved a bit more like men in the labor market. Whereas from the 70s onwards, we have this high, you know, most working women are now married and often with children. And so this gives you kind of this kind of structure that we have now. You know? And so in that sense, we think that 2007, 2009 is really representative of the last few decades before that. Of course, it's a bit amplified because it was larger, but the same qualitative nature.
So then I think to some extent this brings me to the second question. It's something that, perhaps is slightly more. No, it's also related to your previous paper that you just briefly touched upon. When we think about, in the paper you have this kind of the high commutability question, jobs, occupations, right, versus low. So when we, and again, this is linked also to the recession in the sense that, the type of occupations that are lost during the recessions. And I think maybe perhaps this is a more general question I wanted to get your input on. On the one hand, during this pandemic recession, we lose a lot of female occupation in the restaurant industry and in the retail industry. But on the other hand, there are some essential occupation like nurses and hospital workers that are strongly female. And I think you were, in a sense, touching upon that when you were discussing the model's prediction, because you were saying, in the long run, there are some couples, if the wife has a job where, they have to get to work, whereas the husband can stay home. I mean, actually, this kind of, so how do we think about this kind of issues?
I'm glad you mentioned this because that observation is something that drives our at least the possibility of the social change. Because just as you say, we also document in this first paper that there's in fact many couples with that configuration where she's an essential worker like a nurse or a grocery store, and he can work from home, which essentially makes the father the default childcare provider in the crisis. And that's really the two-sided nature of the data. That in the data you see very clearly that women do more of the extra work, but there's also a very clear rise in the fraction of couples where the father is the main provider. This is true in a bunch of countries so far. And so if you think that that more men really getting that experience of being in charge full time. If you think this will drive social change, this is what then matters for the long term. Of course, it's a difficult thing, because it really is a question: is it that experience, or is it just the average? Where you might then think, well, maybe it will even slide back into where we were before. But certainly it's a possibility, and it's really driven by that observation.
Thank you.
Matthias, we have two questions from the audience. I will summarize them. The first one is whether the home office production function is identical to the office in place production one. And the second is whether there's heterogeneity among occupations of parents.
Yeah. Yes, so in our model, productivity is the same. I think it's a very good question, and I think we all think about this every day. Are we equally productive here at home or not? But in our model, we don't go into that. So essentially what we just do is try to match the time use